In the twilight of his life, Ed Sullivan sat in his Manhattan apartment, surrounded by decades of entertainment memorabilia. The man who had introduced America to Elvis, the Beatles, and countless other stars carried with him a secret burden: the artists he had clashed with, censored, and sometimes banned. His conservative values had built a television empire, but they had also created battlegrounds where artistic expression met moral gatekeeping. Before his death, Sullivan would reflect on 6 performers who had tested his limits, challenged his authority, and forced him to confront the changing face of American culture. These weren't just professional disagreements, they were cultural flashpoints that revealed the deep tensions between tradition and revolution, between what America was and what it was becoming. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind television's golden age, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover the conflicts that shaped American entertainment. Elvis Presley. The King, who almost wasn't Sullivan's most famous feud, began with a declaration of war. In 1956, after watching Elvis gyrate on competing shows, the television titan publicly announced he would never book that Presley character. The young singer from Memphis represented everything Sullivan feared about the new generation: raw sexuality, rebellious energy, and a complete disregard for traditional decorum. The host's Catholic upbringing and conservative worldview collided violently with Elvis's hip-thrusting performances. Sullivan had built his Sunday night variety show into America's living room gathering place, where families could watch wholesome entertainment together. Elvis threatened that carefully constructed image with every swivel of his hips. But commerce has a way of changing minds. When Elvis's appearance on a rival show crushed Sullivan's ratings, the host faced an uncomfortable reality. He could maintain his moral high ground and watch his audience disappear, or he could swallow his pride and book the biggest star in America. The compromise Sullivan struck revealed his internal struggle. He would pay Elvis an unprecedented $50,000 for 3 appearances, but only if the cameras showed him from the waist up. It was an attempt to have his cake and eat it too, to capture Elvis's star power while neutering what made him dangerous. Those September and October performances in 1956 drew massive audiences, but Sullivan's discomfort was palpable. Behind the scenes, he reportedly complained about Elvis's vulgar movements and worried about the letters from outraged parents. The host, who had made careers, was grappling with the realization that culture was changing faster than he could control. By Elvis's final appearance in January 1957, something had shifted. Perhaps recognizing the futility of fighting the tide, Sullivan offered an unexpected endorsement. "This is a real decent fine boy." It was a capitulation disguised as approval, a public acknowledgement that Elvis had won their cultural war. The Elvis episodes revealed Sullivan's fundamental dilemma as television's moral arbiter. He could delay the revolution, water it down, or try to shape it. But he couldn't stop it. Elvis had forced America's most powerful entertainment gatekeeper to bend, setting a precedent that would echo through the decades that followed. Buddy Holly. The quiet rebel who wouldn't bend. Buddy Holly possessed a different kind of defiance than Elvis, quieter, more intellectual, but no less determined. When the 21-year-old rocker and his band, the Crickets, were invited to perform on Sullivan's show in 1958, it seemed like a routine booking. Holly had already established himself with hits like Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day, songs that seemed harmless enough for Sullivan's family-friendly format. The conflict erupted over "Oh Boy," a seemingly innocuous rock song that contained the lyrics, "All of my love, all of my kissing, you don't know what you've been missing." By today's standards, the words were tame, but in the conservative landscape of 1950s television, Sullivan found them suggestive and inappropriate for his Sunday night audience. Sullivan's demand was simple: change the song or choose another one. But Holly's response was equally straightforward: no. The young musician refused to alter his art to satisfy a television executive's sensibilities, even if that executive controlled the most powerful platform in American entertainment. The standoff revealed two fundamentally different philosophies about artistic integrity. Sullivan believed in his role as cultural curator, responsible for maintaining standards that reflected Middle American values. Holly represented the emerging artist as individual, someone who viewed creative expression as sacred and non-negotiable. When Sullivan reportedly sabotaged the performance by lowering the band's sound levels, it became personal. The host, who prided himself on professionalism, was willing to undermine a guest's performance out of spite. Holly and the Crickets delivered their song despite the technical difficulties, their energy and charisma cutting through Sullivan's petty revenge. The aftermath was telling. Sullivan never invited Holly back, effectively blacklisting one of rock and roll's most innovative voices from television's premier showcase. For Holly, the experience reinforced his belief that artistic integrity mattered more than mainstream acceptance. The incident became part of rock and roll folklore, especially after Holly's tragic death in a plane crash just months later. The young man who wouldn't compromise his music for television immortality became a symbol of artistic authenticity, his brief life representing the pure spirit of rock and roll before it was packaged and sanitized for mass consumption. Bob Dylan, the voice of dissent. By 1963, Bob Dylan had already begun his transformation from folk singer to cultural prophet. His appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show promised to introduce his unique blend of poetry and protest to mainstream America, but the encounter would become legendary for what didn't happen rather than what did. Dylan arrived at CBS with Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues, a satirical song that mocked the ultra-conservative John Birch Society and the paranoid anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era. The song was classic Dylan, clever, provocative, and unafraid to challenge powerful institutions through humor and intelligence. During rehearsals, Sullivan himself seemed amused by the performance, reportedly giving it his approval. But network executives at CBS grew nervous about potential lawsuits and viewer backlash. They demanded Dylan change the lyrics or choose a different song entirely, fearing even satirical criticism of a political organization could create legal problems. Dylan's response was swift and uncompromising. Rather than negotiate or offer alternatives, he simply walked away. The 21-year-old folk singer chose artistic integrity over national television exposure, a decision that stunned CBS executives who expected young performers to be grateful for any opportunity. The walkout made headlines and enhanced Dylan's reputation as an uncompromising artist. At a time when the civil rights movement was gaining momentum and American involvement in Vietnam was escalating, Dylan's refusal to be censored resonated with young people who were questioning authority and demanding authenticity from their cultural leaders. Sullivan himself was reportedly disappointed by the network's interference, recognizing Dylan's talent even if he didn't always appreciate his politics. The incident highlighted the growing tension between television's need for advertiser-friendly content and artists' desire to address serious social and political issues. Dylan's career trajectory vindicated his decision. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin' became anthems for a generation, and his unwillingness to compromise became part of his legend. The Ed Sullivan Show walkout established Dylan as more than an entertainer. He was a truth-teller who wouldn't let corporate interests dictate his message. The Beatles, chaos in matching suits. When the Beatles arrived in America in February 1964, they brought with them a level of fan hysteria that exceeded anything Ed Sullivan had ever witnessed. The four young men from Liverpool were polite, professional, and undeniably talented, but their very presence threatened to overwhelm the carefully controlled environment of Sullivan's show. Sullivan had discovered the band during a trip to London's Heathrow Airport, where he witnessed thousands of screaming teenagers creating chaos. His business instincts recognized a phenomenon that could boost ratings, but his conservative sensibilities were troubled by the pandemonium that surrounded these mop-top musicians. The Beatles' 3 appearances on Sullivan's show in February 1964 drew unprecedented audiences, with over 73 million Americans watching their debut performance. But behind the scenes, Sullivan struggled with the implications of what he had unleashed. The screaming crowds, the security concerns, and the band's irreverent humor during rehearsals all contributed to his discomfort. John Lennon's sardonic wit particularly grated on Sullivan, who preferred performers who showed proper deference to his authority. The Beatles' cheeky attitudes and casual dismissal of traditional show business protocols represented a generational shift that Sullivan found difficult to navigate. The technical challenges were immense. The screaming fans often drowned out the music, forcing sound technicians to constantly adjust levels. Sullivan worried that the broadcast quality would suffer, and that the chaos would reflect poorly on his show's reputation for professional excellence. Yet, despite his personal reservations, Sullivan recognized that the Beatles represented a cultural earthquake he couldn't ignore. Each of their performances shattered viewing records and attracted the young demographic that advertisers coveted. His business acumen overrode his personal discomfort, at least temporarily. As the Beatles evolved throughout the 1960s, becoming more experimental and politically outspoken, their relationship with Sullivan's show grew more distant. The clean-cut image they had maintained during their early appearances gave way to longer hair, psychedelic music, and controversial statements that made them less suitable for Sullivan's increasingly anachronistic format. The Beatles' success on Sullivan's show marked the beginning of the British invasion and changed American popular culture forever. But for Sullivan personally, it represented a moment when he realized the cultural changes sweeping America might be too powerful for any television host to control or contain. James Brown, the Godfather's uncontainable energy. James Brown represented everything Ed Sullivan feared about the changing landscape of American entertainment. The self-proclaimed Godfather of Soul brought an intensity and physicality to performance that shattered every convention of television variety shows. His high-octane displays of passion, combined with his explicitly black cultural identity, challenged Sullivan's comfort zone in profound ways. Brown's performances were religious experiences disguised as entertainment. He would leap, spin, drop into splits, and work himself into such a frenzy that his band members would drape a cape over his shoulders as he collapsed, only to watch him throw it off and resume his manic energy. This wasn't the polished, restrained presentation that Sullivan preferred from his guests. The host's discomfort with Brown went beyond mere style preferences. In an era when television still largely segregated black performers into narrow, acceptable categories, Brown's raw power and uncompromising authenticity threatened to expose the artificial constraints of mainstream entertainment. He couldn't be sanitized or made palatable without destroying what made him extraordinary. When Brown did appear on Sullivan's show, the performances were carefully managed and heavily restricted. Producers worked to frame his appearances in ways that would minimize controversy, asking him to tone down his signature moves and moderate his volcanic energy. But Brown, ever the perfectionist and proud artist, pushed back against these limitations whenever possible. The tension reflected broader cultural conflicts of the 1960s. America was grappling with civil rights, generational change, and evolving ideas about authenticity and expression. Brown represented the new America, bold, emotional, and unapologetically black, while Sullivan embodied traditional values that seemed increasingly outdated. Sullivan's reluctant tolerance of Brown revealed his recognition that American culture was changing whether he approved or not. The ratings and audience response to Brown's appearances demonstrated that viewers were hungry for something real and powerful, even if it made conventional television executives uncomfortable. Brown understood the importance of these mainstream platforms while refusing to compromise his artistic vision. As he once said, "If I got a few seconds to show the world what we're about, I'm going to use every bit of it." His brief but memorable appearances on Sullivan's show became testimonies to his relentless drive to break barriers. The relationship between Sullivan and Brown was never warm, but it was historically significant. Sullivan's willingness to feature Brown, despite personal misgivings, acknowledged that the times were changing and that artists like James Brown were leading that charge. The Doors. When Art Meets Defiance. The Doors' encounter with Ed Sullivan in 1967 became one of the most famous acts of television rebellion in entertainment history. The band, led by the charismatic and unpredictable Jim Morrison, represented everything that made Sullivan nervous about the new generation of rock musicians. They were intellectual, rebellious, and completely unwilling to compromise their artistic vision for mainstream acceptance. The controversy centered on their breakthrough hit, "Light My Fire," specifically the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." CBS executives and Sullivan's producers requested that Morrison change "higher" to something less suggestive of drug use, a reasonable request in their minds given the conservative television landscape of the late 1960s. Morrison agreed to the change during rehearsals, leading Sullivan to believe the performance would proceed smoothly. But when the cameras rolled live, Morrison deliberately sang the original lyric, staring defiantly into the camera as he delivered the forbidden word. It was a calculated act of rebellion that sent shockwaves through the CBS studio. Sullivan was reportedly furious, his face flushed with anger as the band finished their performance. The host, who prided himself on maintaining control over every aspect of his show, had been publicly defied by a leather-clad rock star who seemed to relish the confrontation. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Sullivan canceled the Doors' planned second performance that evening and banned them from ever appearing on his show again. Morrison's response was characteristically nonchalant. He reportedly shrugged and said the band had more important things to do anyway. The incident crystallized the growing divide between establishment entertainment and the counterculture movement. Morrison represented a new kind of performer who viewed artistic integrity as more important than commercial success or mainstream approval. His defiance of Sullivan became legendary among rock fans and cemented his reputation as a rebellious icon. For Sullivan, the encounter represented a loss of authority that he found deeply troubling. The carefully controlled environment he had created for his show was being challenged by artists who didn't respect traditional boundaries or hierarchies. Morrison's rebellion suggested that the old rules no longer applied. The Doors' band performance became part of rock and roll mythology, inspiring countless other artists to prioritize authenticity over commercial considerations. Morrison's willingness to sacrifice television exposure for artistic principle established him as a counterculture hero whose influence extended far beyond music. Ed Sullivan's relationships with these six performers reveal the profound cultural tensions that defined American entertainment in the mid-20th century. Each conflict represented more than personal disagreements. They were battles over the soul of American popular culture, fought between those who sought to preserve traditional values and those who demanded the freedom to express new realities. Sullivan's role as cultural gatekeeper placed him at the center of a revolution he couldn't fully understand or control. His conservative instincts led him to resist changes that seemed threatening to the established order, yet his business acumen forced him to recognize the power and popularity of the very artists he found troubling. The irony of Sullivan's legacy is that his show, intended as a bastion of wholesome family entertainment, became the launching pad for the cultural revolution he sought to contain. By providing a platform for Elvis, the Beatles, and others, he inadvertently accelerated the very changes he hoped to moderate. These conflicts ultimately revealed the futility of trying to control artistic expression through institutional authority. The performers who refused to bend, Dylan, Morrison, Holly, and Brown, became legends precisely because they chose authenticity over acceptance. Their principled stands inspired generations of artists to prioritize creative integrity over commercial success. The battles between tradition and innovation continue to shape entertainment today. What other cultural gatekeepers have found themselves overwhelmed by the forces of change? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from entertainment history.